Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And today we're going to be looking at 1 Timothy 1 3 through 11. And this is where Paul gives a warning to Timothy about false teachings and false teachers and kind of who they are. And again, he just dives straight into it. So we're going to read these verses real quick and we'll get into the notes and the details of what he means by what he's writing here. 1 Timothy 1 3 through 11, he says, "When I left for Macedonia, I urged you to stay there in Ephesus and stop those whose teaching is contrary to the truth. Don't let them waste their time in endless discussions of myths and spiritual pedigrees. These things only lead to meaningless speculations, which don't help live a life of faith in God." And I'll be honest with you, and we're going to dive into a little bit what he was actually pointing to directly. But there's a lot of this, right? I feel like sometimes in the church there's a lot of this type of stuff where we get into this like meaningless speculation and meaningless diving into the things that really don't really build up the faith. In the end, they may like make us look smart, right? Or make it look like we know what we're talking about, but it doesn't do anything to help us live a life of faith in God. It doesn't, it definitely doesn't do anything to help build up other people. And so I think we need to understand what he's getting at here. You know, he may be applying this in a certain way to these false teachers at this time, but I think sometimes we can get caught up in this, right? We try to become so educated in the word, right? In a sense, not that we know the word, but that's like we try to figure out what every single thing means exactly, as you know, and I think that takes away from just living a faithful life of Christ. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with studying the Bible and trying to learn the Bible, but it's when those things take over and take precedence over spreading the gospel and bringing people to Christ. And a lot of times what we do is we turn inward and we just have these classes and have this stuff where it's just us, you know, going back and forth on what we think this means, what we think this means. And a lot of times, I'm not saying always, but a lot of times it's just to build our own egos up and make it look like we know what we're talking about or we're really smart when we should be taking it out to other people and spreading the word of God. So again, I'm not trying to come down too harsh, but I think that's important. He says in verse 5, "The purpose of my instruction is that all believers will be filled with love that comes from a pure heart, a clear conscience, and genuine faith. But some people have missed the whole point." And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. They have turned away from these things and they spend their time in meaningless discussions. They want to be known as teachers of the law of Moses, but they don't want to. They don't know what they're talking about, even though they speak so confidently. We know what the law is good. We know that the law is good when used correctly. For the law was not intended for people who do what is right. He's using this right here, this starting in verse 9, to actually insult them, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. It is for people who are lawless and rebellious, and are ungodly and sinful, who consider nothing sacred and defile what is holy, who kill their father or mother or commit other murders. The law is for people who are sexually immoral, who practice homosexuality, or are slave traders, liars, promise breakers, or who do anything else that contradicts the wholesome teaching that comes from the glorious good news entrusted to me by our blessed God. And so Paul's greetings, right? So to go back to the beginning, Paul's greetings are usually followed by like some sort of thanksgiving or praise or blessing to God, right? But in First Timothy and in Titus, he doesn't include that, and I think part of that is because of the character of the letter and how official it is. That's and the authority behind it. That he's getting directly to the point, right? It's like, hey, this is from who? We're getting directly to the point here, and so, and instead, Paul just addresses his concerns, and this is to silence the false teachers, right? Because he can't give them praise for what they're doing. He's saying, hey, you know, because obviously Timothy's going to probably share this letter and or communicate what's said in it to the people there. And so he says, stop those contrary to the truth, right? Just as Paul had previously learned, we talked about this in Acts 20, right? False teachers came into the church in Ephesus. This letter was written to help Timothy to deal with them. So he's saying, stop them, right? No, we're not playing around. Stop them. And he talks about how they are people who are in endless discussion and meaningless speculations. The literal translation is in myths and endless genealogies. You know, back in this time, genealogy was important. Which basically the thing is these things cause speculation. And so genealogy was an important thing. If you've ever read through the Bible, you see that some of the most boring parts to me, anyways, of the Bible is the reading through the genealogies. Usually, I skip them. But he's dismissing their teachings as trivial, right? It's like they're meaningless. And he's also seems to be rejecting the fanciful the basically basically the fanciful nature of their interpretations, and what a lot of times was probably their immoral justification for their behavior, right? And one of the things that he dives into, and kind of emphasizes on, Paul does, is spiritual pedigrees, which basically the literal Greek translation here is endless genealogies, right? So in Judaism, one's genealogy established one's spiritual pedigree. So a lot of times where you came from, right? If you came from a prominent family and all these type of things, a prominent line of rabbis or teachers or that kind of stuff. And so we see these kind of things, and so he was rejecting this, right? And Paul's teaching was, they looks like you guys are preoccupied with this stuff. You're not focusing on what's important, right? And so we've got to be careful as Christians not to get caught up in this. We need to make sure we are focusing on the things that are important and not arguing or buckling down on the things that aren't, right? I've seen so many churches that they get so caught up in tradition. And if you actually look at what really was happening here, in a sense, the church here, the people that came from, especially under the law, they were getting caught back up in their traditions, right? They wanted to hold on to the tradition, so they were making the traditions that they had the important, and like basically raising them to the top of things they were talking about, things that they were focusing on, and taking away from them the message of God, the gospel. And Paul's like, this stuff's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. And we do, and unfortunately, we do that in the church today, right? We focus on things that in the end are really meaningless, right? They're not salvation issues. They're not, there's stuff that we've done, maybe our great grandparents or our grandparents or our parents did, but they're not something that we have to do. It's nothing biblical. And that's what Paul's getting at, I think, in this, and hinting at in a similar way with what they're doing here. And so he says, right, which don't help people live a life of faith in God, right? What he's saying here is, these things that you're discussing, they're not helping anyone live a faithful life in God. They're not building someone up. I remember, man, there were times where we would go to church and we would have discussions in Bible class, and you left feeling defeated because of what was talked about, and the way things were talked about, or the way people were talked about, and the things versus being lifted up, right? A biblical discussion in most cases, right, should be, once you go and you study the Bible, especially together in a group, you should walk away from that lifted up or convicted, right? There's times where you're going to be convicted of things, or really, something's going to tear at your heart, maybe, and some of that. I'm not saying you should just every single time walk away with cheer and joy and rejoicing the whole time, but it should not be a case where when you come in out of a Bible class, that it's something that you're like, man, I wish I'd never gone in there. That was so discouraging. Why, I can't believe people act like this, or why are we wasting our time discussing things like this, right? And that should not be the way church. And so that's what Paul's going to here and saying, like, the things that we're discussing, the things that we teach, should be helpful for people to live a faithful life in God, right? The literal translation is they rather than a stewardship of God in faith, right? And so it should be stirring us up. The Greek use here is important, because Paul's stewardship, household management, is what this Greek word means. It has to be done with the household. And so the phrase can be translated a number of ways, such as faithfulness to God's household management, or faithfulness in managing God's household. But basically what he's saying is this is not managing the church well, right? You're not helping people live a life of faith in God. You're not managing the church well, right? Because people are walking away. You're discussing things that don't matter. You're not building up people's faith. You're actually tearing people's faith down. And so you're not stewarding the household of God, the church, well. And that's, this is when Paul's writing. He's not saying Timothy's doing this. He's saying the church in Ephesus, especially the leadership in Ephesus, this is what they're doing. And so he then dives in and says, the purpose of my instructions. Paul is seeking godliness. I'm sorry. Paul is seeking godliness that flows out of sound faith and renewal, right? He says we need to be focusing on the right things, focusing on the things that matter, not on all this other junk that you are focusing on to basically, in a way, make yourself seem important. And so Paul now elaborates on these false teachers, and he turns their subject matter against them. So this is Paul is really good at this when he's writing, and we've seen this before. And so he uses the word some people, and so this is directed at those who are false teachers. It's a put down, right? It's demoting the false teachers to a general class of opponents of the good news. So he's like some people, right? The way he phrases this here, they were professing believers who had missed the whole point of the good news and had turned away. And so a lot of times they probably didn't even realize it because they thought they were doing the will of God in many cases. And we've got to be careful not to get caught up in this. Right? And I've seen a lot of times where professing believers get caught up in the things that don't matter, and they'll focus on the things that don't matter, and they'll preach on and teach on and harp on these things that don't matter, and this will be their entire identity, and they lose focus of the gospel, right? And so they focus on all mostly what I would call tradition things, or things that have been taught for a couple hundred years, and they don't focus on the good news of God, and they don't focus on the gospel, and they don't focus on converting people to Christ. And before they know it, they look around and they're sitting in a church building that used to be quite large, and now you've got 20 or 30, 40 people. And so that is, and then they'll justify it by saying, well, we're speaking the truth, and that's why we're, that kind of stuff. That's not what Paul's saying. No, right? You're missing the whole point of the good news, and you've turned away from it. Right. And so then he goes on to talk about the law right here. He says the law was not intended for people who do what is right. So more than likely what we see here, and we'll dive into this more as we go deeper into it, is that the people, or these false teachers, were pushing back into the law, right? Like a lot of them did. This is what a lot of what Paul had to emphasize. And so because they were relying on the law, he then twists it and says, well, the law is not intended for people who do what is right. So he's like, well, if you're so basically what he's saying to them is, so you're so intent on keeping the law, but guess what? The law's not for those who do it. And then he gives a list of all the people that the law is for. And so he's basically calling them, these false teachers, all these things, because in principle, the virtuous person doesn't need the law. Right? For Christians, a righteous life results from faith apart from the law. We put our faith in Christ who fulfilled the law. So we don't have to fulfill it. We don't have to worry about fulfilling the law. We don't have to focus on the law. We focus on Christ, do what he said, and the rest is taken care of for us. And so he's saying we don't need the law. The law is intended for people who are doing what's wrong. And then he lists all these things, horrible things in especially Jewish culture, and then even in today's culture, right? Especially the Christian culture, be horrible things. It's the things that he accuses them of being. And so it was an insult to him. And the list portrays the ultimate tendency of the false teachers, right? The human nature of these false teachers' teachings, their underlying spiritual state, and their superior righteousness of the good news. So he's pointing out who they think they are. Or in many cases, he's probably pointing out some of their sinfulness in this as well. And so Paul, not only does Paul in this letter warn against false teachers, tells Timothy to take care of them, he then kind of exposes them for who they are, for who they really are. And that is people who they're not worried about the gospel. They're worried about their man-made traditions. They're worried about going back into the law. They're worried about not obeying the gospel, but basically doing things to make themselves look important, lift them up. And instead of lifting Christ up and the gospel message up, they're lifting themselves up. And that's what Paul is exposing here. So we're going to dive deeper into this as we get further on. The next section, Paul's going to then switch to talking about the gratitude, or his gratitude for God's mercy, because if it weren't for that, then a lot of these people would have no hope. And so we're going to dive into this. So I hope that you're learning from this. Again, there's much more I could dive into as we go deeper into this, but I want you to get an understanding of what Timothy is going up against and what's happening here in Ephesus. That way, as we go deeper and deeper into this lesson, we get a better understanding of the meaning of some of the things that Paul writes. So, as always, appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these. I encourage you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so yet. That way, you'll get the notifications as we go through this. But as always, appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.